Oscar in this that I know. Okay, we're being live streamed. That's a good sign that things are working. The thumbs up from Darren and Woody that we're live on YouTube. We can take off here. Oh, we got a thumbs up. All right. Well, welcome everybody. We've got the whole complement here. Woody muted, running things behind the scene. Rick, Darren, David. And we're going to go through some images from Costa Rica. We're going to talk about some of the fun stuff that we learned there. We had one heck of a workshop. We have several people in the room that were there with us. Gary, Carl, Elizabeth here in the Zoom chat. And talk about a few little fun things. I actually learned more on this workshop than I have in a long time. I don't know how you feel about it, David.
Oh yeah, I always do.
Well, before we get started on that, why don't we do a little bit of housekeeping? We had an interesting week last week with the Yellowstone stuff going on. We're sort of in that phase where we're starting to get ready on the planning side for Yellowstone, and as most of you saw, you know, they had some pretty horrendous flooding, especially in the northern part of the park,
which is where we were planning on staying and spending quite a bit of time photographing wildlife.
Yeah, so we ended up making the decision at the end of the week to sort of move the Yellowstone workshop to the Tetons. We have one in Tetons the week before, so now we're doing two workshops in the Tetons. And almost everybody from the Yellowstone workshop wanted to move over to the Tetons, so that's pretty good. But we still got to have a few spots open, correct?
Well, we had a cancellation in the first Tetons workshop. Someone had a scheduling event come up with family. So we have two spots opened in the first Teton workshop, and we have potentially a single spot open in the second workshop. We're not totally sure. So there's very limited space, and they're the last open workshop slots that we have this year. And so we're going to talk about it here a little bit because, you know, this is a largely wildlife shooting focused office hours, and that's going to be the next big opportunity to photograph wildlife. Totally different than Costa Rica. You got these big wide open scenes with spectacular mountain backdrops and wetlands and an interesting mix of kind of, you know, American plains wildlife. Actually, let me show you a few pictures from the Tetons while we're just talking about it. You know, I think that the Tetons is an amazing place to photograph both landscapes and wildlife because you just got this spectacular backdrop. It reminds me a lot of Patagonia, actually, and just the way that the weather blows through there and how gorgeous these clouds are with the Snake River winding through. And, you know, of course, you've got the old, you know, Mormon Row Americana to do landscape photography with at dawn. And there's tons of moose and bison and gorgeous wetlands, reflections, clouds. It's really, really a fun place to go. And that time of year, maybe you get a dusting of snow up on the ridges. Tons and tons of just photographic glory to be had there. It seems like every trip, it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
And we always have a ton of fun. This should be a pretty wet year too. Last year when we ran it, it was a little bit dry. And this year there's a lot more snow. Just a great time. Here's David Archer on the prowl doing his wildlife kind of amazingness. So if anybody wants in on that, I would jump in soon because there's only a couple slots remaining.
All right.
Oh, and on the second one that's replacing the Yellowstone workshop, we are hoping, you know, that they're going to be able to open up for us to get the commercial use permit for the southern half of Yellowstone, and we would still go in and do the Glacier Basin since that's largely a Yellowstone crew that's relocated into the Tetons. So
yeah.
Permitting.
Yes, that's the big question.
We'll go in and
Hudson, that's geysers and stuff, right? And pools.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the Grand Prismatic Spring, the big paint pots, and Old Faithful and some of that stuff. You know, the bulk of the wildlife is up in the Lamar Valley, and that's just going to be. I can't foresee that reopening this year.
The last press conference the superintendent had was that they're working because it's a lifeline through. It's a public road through the Lamar Valley. They're working to try and get that at least open before winter, but there's doubtful that it's going to be open for heavy duty tourism or permitting. Southern Loop actually is due to open tomorrow, and they're expecting that it'll remain open. They dodged the bullet, I guess, on the second potential flooding that they were worried about this last weekend. So,
but there's no word yet on whether or not they're going to be issuing permits.
Yeah, last time I checked, they were dealing with other stuff. Shall we say?
I think it's all
Understandably so. Understandably so.
Yeah.
It's absolutely horrifying to see some of the places that we've been and what's happened to them. So,
yeah.
The only other piece of business I got is the next office hours will be on July 19th, and we're going to do an image gallery, a special one, right?
Yeah, we're going to do macro, and I'd love it. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just making sure Carl J is paying attention.
We're going to do macro. And if you guys could create a macro image, or one that's taken this year. I know some of you that were in the Costa Rica workshop with us did some fun stuff there. And David and I led a couple of trips to these two different places where we did macro photography. And I actually learned a ton from our local guide, Dennis, about doing some handheld macro using a really similar technique to wildlife shooting, burst mode, manual camera settings with auto ISO, and working in pairs and having someone else light the subject. We were, of course, shooting wildlife, frogs and snakes and things like that. But I think with just about anything you're doing, you could set up your own lighting, use window light, whatever you want to do with the lighting. But the handheld kind of macro was a really interesting technique. And I'm going to be talking about that in an ATS before that office hours within the next couple of weeks. So we'll we'll talk about macro a little bit, and we'll look through your macro images in the next office hours.
Okay, so that's July 19th.
All right,
well,
Woody will get a submissions
have-
gallery set up on the office hours. Oh, what?
Yeah, we'll
Woody?
try and have signups open later today.
Perfect. So you'll be able to just submit, and you can ask a question while you're at it. I don't know how much time we'll have for questions, but you guys always submit so many amazing images. We wind up taking the hour just oohing and awing over everybody's work.
Yeah.
So y'all
All
just
right.
get pats on the back.
So Costa Rica, it sounded like it sucked. Is that correct?
Yeah, Costa Rica was a terrible time. Terrible time shooting thousands of images a day just because so much to photograph. My God. It was such a fun time. Great group of people. Unbelievable local guide. Our guide Dennis. We will not go with anyone but Dennis in the future. And I don't know. I turned around. We have a 2023 workshop slot kind of slate. You guys have seen it. If you go over to the workshops page, you can express interest in those workshops. But we don't really have room for Costa Rica in 2023. But we've shoehorned it into planning for 2024. It was such an amazing wildlife shooting experience, and different. Deep jungle filled with wildlife, just constant stops for birds or monkeys or lizards or frogs. It was just amazing. Crocodiles right by where we're staying. Just nuts. David?
Yeah, it was pretty special.
And so we're gonna go through looking at some images, and we're gonna talk about some different lenses that we used, and probably a little bit about technique. I was won over to David's technique using manual, just because so many times there's a mother monkey and a baby monkey, and maybe you want to get all of their eyes in focus. And so using shutter priority with, it just defaults to the widest aperture possible, and shooting with, big long lenses like this 800, you wind up with a real shallow depth of field. And if things aren't moving, maybe you want to bump the aperture up to f11 and try to get everybody's eyes in focus. And so running auto ISO, watching the aperture, watching the shutter speed, watching where the ISO is ramping up to. But it was complicated shooting conditions. We worked in a lot of changing light, deep forest, darker conditions. Sometimes you're shooting up backlit against the sky. Sometimes it's deep, dark woods with just a little light filtering down through the canopy. Constantly evolving situation. So, using auto ISO was really critical. I can see a question forming, Rick.
Well, I was just going to say, just as a point of reference, could you quickly sort of explain the way you used to shoot, which was shutter priority, correct?
shutter priority auto ISO. And I just sort of assumed, well, it's always going to default to having the widest aperture to get you the highest quality image. And that's pretty great when you're shooting a single subject. Now, all of a sudden, when you have a family of monkeys sitting on a branch that are all slightly different distance from you, you start noticing as you go through culling your images from the night before, oh, wow, I've only got one eye out of all these eyes in focus. And that works for a shot, but it'd be really nice to have all the eyes in focus. They weren't moving around much. They were just sitting quietly looking back at me. And so going to that manual mode, you need to make sure you stay pretty wide open most of the time. You're watching your aperture, you're watching your ISO, you're watching your shutter speed. If the animals are moving, you need to bump that shutter speed up and be chimping your images and looking to see that they are fast enough shutter speed to be freezing the motion. But when they're sitting still, you can start experimenting with rolling that shutter speed down. And I, believe it or not, in burst mode, shooting in that 20 frame per second burst mode, was getting nice, sharp images in the middle of my burst at a 30th of a second handheld with this 800. That's how good our image stabilization is these days. It's a whole new world from the old rule of it would have to be 1/800th of a second. I was consistently getting good frames at a 60th of a second, and at 100th of a second, they're almost all sharp. So, if there's not motion, if your subject's still, you can start playing with lowering that shutter speed, watching your ISO, trying to get it in range. And then you take some shots and you say, well, it'd be nice to try to get one where the mom and the baby's eyes are all in focus. Let's ramp up to f11 and try a few at a 30th of a second, trying to have really good technique. And, you don't want to have 14,000 ISO if you can avoid it. So you're kind of constantly playing this balancing game. I'd still recommend shutter priority for people that are just new to this kind of stuff and are really, they just need to focus on composition and keeping a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the motion. But if you're up to watching all three settings and keeping track of them and not forgetting and leaving your camera at f11 so that then for the rest of the day, you're shooting everything at 14,000 ISO, that's the danger. Is you really need to be on top of it. You need to be looking at all three numbers in your viewfinder while you're out working.
And you were not shooting. You were not shooting birds in flight here. Or were you?
When I was shooting birds in flight, occasionally, using the 100 to 400 or the 800 if they're perched. There was a moment. I'll show you a picture where these macaws were feeding off nuts on a palm tree. And they were consistently flying to this patch of nuts and flying back. And I was able to catch them in flight. But the minute I did that, I opened the aperture wide open, ramped my shutter speed up to 2,000th of a second because I want to freeze that motion. Totally different thing. And so let's jump in. Let's look at some pictures. We can talk a little more. We can take some questions. And I'm going to start off with some pictures actually that David Archer took, and I'll let him talk through a few of these.
Yeah, this was rocking around the property in Crocodile Bay. I had some time before the workshop and a little bit of time after, but this was right there on the property. And this is an owl butterfly. And it's got some things built in to ward off predators. One is that big eye in the bottom that looks like an owl eye. But if you look up in the top right corner, it looks like the face of a snake.
Oh, it totally does. And
so
this is with your 400?
Yeah, that's with the 400 wide open.
Beautiful.
And it really throws a nice blur on the background for that.
I think both of those lenses do, but your 400 is something special. Of course, it costs enough it should be, but it really is beautiful.
Yeah. And this was on the property also. This is the lagoon where the crocodiles are. This is a immature lizard, a basilisk lizard, also called Jesus Christ lizards because they can run across the surface of the water. Their feet have a special way of trapping air bubbles and gives them flotation, but they'll run across the water on their hind legs mostly.
And I'm just going to assume these are all with your 400 unless you say otherwise.
Yeah, I think they almost all are.
We traded off a bit.
There was one just as you guys are thinking about stuff, there was one question that came up a couple times, which is, were you guys hand holding these big honking lenses, or were you using monopods, tripods, that type of stuff?
Yeah,
exclusively hand holding.
I took a monopod and a tripod, didn't use either one a single time.
Ditto. These lenses, are big, but they're not that heavy, and they're balanced way toward the back. So hand holding is really not bad. It's just shocking. This is a howler monkey.
Right. This was also on the property when we were walking around with the group the first day the group came.
I remember that. Yeah, I haven't gotten through culling that little section of images, but that's beautiful. You know, they make the most amazing sound. You can hear them coming, and first time you hear them out in the forest, it feels like something from an alien movie. You hear, ooh.
I know they are loud when
What is coming? It's terrifying. But this is with the 400 as well.
correct. Yeah.
You know what? What I
With
love, David, is how you kept the tail wrapped around the tree in the frame. That's just awesome.
Yeah, I think it created some nice triangles and
Yep.
Really nice.
As far as
All right,
monkey
let's-
photos go.
yeah. I was thinking, what would Rick do here?
That's lovely.
Yeah.
It is, isn't it?
That one is a yellow-throated toucan.
Mm.
Was happy to get that with a nice background too. They're pretty skittish birds. They're kind of hard to catch in the wild, and so I was happy to get a close-up shot of this guy.
Now, did you flip the teleconverter to 560 on this one?
Yeah,
Yeah. David's lens, the one that we both shot with each other's lenses, and that 400, that one of the great things about it is there's just a big smooth action lever that's easy access to your right hand. You flip it and all of a sudden clunk, it's a 560 f4. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
yeah. I think all of these have been at 560 so far, except for the butterfly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Now this is with Hudson's 800 when we switched.
Mm-hmm. That's
The-
gorgeous. Yeah, I remember I was over doing something totally different and working with the group, and by the time I got over here, this scene had changed. But man, this is just a gorgeous shot of this pair, the mother and the baby.
Unfortunately, I was standing in an ant nest right about this time.
I remember I came over, started shooting, and I just hear David going, "Damn, these ants!" And he's like taking his pants up and his shoes off. Here's one of the macro shots we were talking about.
Right. And this, I don't have the new Z105 macro, and I borrowed yours and borrowed another guy's for a couple of shots. So this was at the Z9, that 105.
I've got a question for you. Are you going to be ordering that 105 in the wake of that?
Yeah, probably so. Damn you, Hudson Henry.
I know we've cost each other a bit of money over the years. That's a very sharp lens. This is such a cool composition, David. I just love the red triangle up at the top.
Yep.
Amazing.
Yeah, I could have cropped it out, but I thought it made a nice line to leave it in.
Yeah.
No, I love it. I love it. This one's really cool too.
So how are you guys lighting these?
Loom cubes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Yeah.
other people holding them, or?
Yeah.
It was a 2-person. These particular ones, there were 2 people. Or is this was this one lit or is this natural light, David?
No, this was lit. I just had to clone out the catch lights.
We did one day of total natural light, and we did one day with loom cubes. And the loom cubes, you do have to clone them out of the eyes because it looks a little unnatural having all those LED dots.
Mhm.
But nice job of it. And yeah, we worked in pairs always. Often the other guide that we had, our local guide Dennis, was holding for one area, and I was holding in another area. I actually didn't shoot that much this day. I mainly held lights for people and talked through settings, and which was really fun. It was fun to work with I enjoyed working as a team. It's kind of a 2-part thing, creatively lighting and shooting, and I thought that was a lot of fun.
Again, we had some questions beforehand, and then before the workshop about, should I bring my flashes? And a couple of people have asked about flash, would you bring a flash to Costa Rica type of thing? And you didn't bring any flashes, correct?
Didn't bring any flashes. And
All
I
loom
think
cubes.
part of the reason is we're working with creatures too. and the flashes disturb them. You know, we're dripping water over these frogs. These frogs are wild. They're not captive. The places that we went to are conservation oriented. They've reclaimed land that used to be farmland and are turning it back to rainforest. And the people who run them, when we have a big group like this, they do a lot of outreach and work with local school children and talk about conservation and protecting the rainforest. And then when a big group like us comes, you know, we pay them enough money that they go out into the forest, and the night before they'll catch some of these creatures for us to macro photograph. And then they're very careful about making sure that they're not overly stressed, and we're pouring water over them and keeping them comfortable. And then, you know, if you're firing flashes at them, it's a bit more stressful than a little bit of constant light from a more of a distance. So,
Yeah.
Hey, what autofocus settings are you using for some of these macro shots, David?
I think I was using probably small area AF with eye detection.
And I was using 3D with eye detect and just putting the 3D point right near the eye, and it was locking right on.
Well, actually, but yeah, I was doing the hybrid thing starting off and 3D on the back button.
Yeah, exactly. This is what you know, I love that mode, and I am so much more even yet a believer in it after this trip. If you have the wide area or small area on the shutter button and you see a bird in flight, you can just use the shutter button and lock that bird as if you had group area on. And then, you know, if you've got something that's a little more predictable, you'll see it lock the eye, then just hit the back button, and all of a sudden you've got the eye locked and it can move anywhere in the frame, and you keep tracking it. You know, you can convert that wide or small area autofocus into 3D point on the back with the Z9. And I am sure that the Nikon cameras that come into the future will bring that along as, you know, that tech bleeds down. It's pretty wonderful, and it was working great for the macros. I would just move my 3D point to where it was on the eye, or move my frame and then hit the back button and lock it and frame however I wanted, and it kept tracking the eye.
Yeah, the eye detect seemed to work pretty well for these frogs since the eyes were so large, but usually on reptiles it doesn't work so well, like on alligators and crocodiles and lizards.
It was working on the crocodile pretty well for me, depending on the light though.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. This is beautiful, David.
Yeah, this was at the sloth farm. You know, I thought their faces were real compelling, so I thought it was worth zooming in on their faces on a couple of shots. Yeah, they almost look like they're smiling a lot of the time.
They do. I'm convinced they have terrible vision, worse than bears by a long shot. You can just tell they can't see much. They're really cute. I love this one.
This was a
That was right after it rained. It rained so hard, and we were all under that covered area eating those amazing quesadillas with that homemade hot sauce. And then it stopped raining, and we went out, and these sloths looked like they just gotten out of the shower.
Yeah. This was about a 10-second yawn. As
You did some distraction
removal
here. You did some distraction removal here, I'm sure, because they were in a lot of leaves and bushes and stuff.
Not on this one, but I think on another, probably the next one.
You got a great window right there. Gorgeous. Yeah, this one for sure. Yeah, beautiful. Great stuff, David.
Yeah, I did have to remove some sticks and things across this one. In fact, there was a branch across his claw, and you couldn't really see his claw, so I did have to clone that out.
That's some meticulous work. You did a great job.
Yeah,
David says sloth farm. It's our guide Dennis's grandfather's farm. They suddenly noticed that there were sloths in the woods, and it was, I think, part of the genesis of Dennis's, you know, whole becoming a conservationist photographer guide was protecting that stretch of woods, and then kind of funding the whole thing by bringing groups in to photograph sloths in their natural habitat. So we call it the sloth farm, but they're living wild out there, and there's just generally, you know, several of them in sight when you go out to the farm. And Dennis's family makes amazing food, and you grind up sugarcane with lime, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful day out there.
That was good.
It's really good.
This is
This
back
is at 400.
Yeah, let's see. Let me look at my image here. Yeah, with it was 560. It was with 400 with the teleconverter, 1/4000th of a second f4, ISO
Cool.
640. This was on the property after the other people had left. Not good light and not good background, but I was happy to be able to catch one in flight.
Well, it's a beautiful, beautiful shot. I
Yeah,
love
the
it.
background bugs
Oh,
me, but can't have everything.
Oh, you can't have everything. That's why you got to go back 2024.
That's
I
right.
love this one.
Yeah, the little spider monkey.
This is that spider monkey that was having a hard time. Its mom was kind of pushing it away. It's like an adolescent having yeah, we photographed this monkey for quite a bit. I have a fun shot of it too. I threw in, this is beautiful framing. I love how it's framed in the tree there, and that moment with the arm up over the limb and the tail wrapped around. And then I have one of David at work proving, you know, we're hand holding these lenses. Here it is. This is a 800 millimeter portrait, I think, inside the butterfly garden.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure, somewhere where there's some structure. I probably should zap that, but. And this is an image I took just to kind of show the conditions. This is while I was working with David's 400. It just does such a beautiful job rendering the out of focus details. But you know, this is a road that leads out to just pure rainforest, and it goes through some farms, and there's some cattle grazing area, but there's trees all along, and there's tons of wildlife. And we drive this road really slowly, and there's constantly things to see. I mean, you go about 6 miles and it takes 3 hours because we hop out photographing monkeys, photographing macaws, photographing owls, photographing, you know, snakes, whatever it happens to be. And Dennis, the guide, is just, I have no idea how he does it. He's driving down the road and then he's like, oh, you know, crested owl. And you hop out and way up in a tree, there's a crested owl. But you can see that the light is complicated. You know, sometimes you're shooting things in these shadowy areas. Sometimes you're shooting things in these brightly lit, backlit areas. There's traffic coming through. So we guides are constantly like, motorcycle, get out of the middle of the road. And then you get into the deep rainforest and it gets even slightly more complicated. Now, I wanted to say really quickly, we've been talking a lot about all these big lenses, right? That, you know, the 800 that I have, the 400 that David has. I think that if you're really into wildlife photography and you've got the resources, this 800 millimeter on the Z9 and David's 400 millimeter are just as good as it gets for doing wildlife photography. For me, you know, I love having this 800 alongside the 100 to 400, which with the 1.4 teleconverter gets you everything from 100 to what, 1020 or something like that, 1120, some crazy number on full frame. But early in my trip, I was out with my family and I brought this as the backup, believe it or not, a Z50 with the 50 to 250 and my 16 to 50, which is, you know, $1,000 kit with the lenses and everything. Maybe it's $1,100 or something. And I find, you know, when I'm traveling light, when I'm with the family, I get fantastic images with that. You know, I have no problem shooting around with that kit. And I'll show you a couple shots I got, and actually a couple shots that my wife took with that setup. Let me go full image here. So, you know, running around with my wife and my kids. Costa Rica is beautiful. We had great conditions out there. The beaches are lovely. The kids love the monkeys and the hermit crabs and the wildlife. There was a day where kids were swimming in a pool and Stacy was photographing them, and all of a sudden the first spider monkeys that we saw showed up. And, you know, this image isn't maybe going to print huge, but it's going to print big enough for my kids' room. And Stacy snapped it with the Z50 at I think 12,000 ISO, and I ran it through DxO Pure Raw 2. It lost a little bit of detail, but it's a nice sharp image. You know, here's one in a little bit better light that she took this one too, of a squirrel monkey, the first squirrel monkeys that we saw on the trip. And then, you know, once we got a little bit more serious, I started shooting with the 100 to 400. And that gives you a nice range. I love that kind of zoom range, you know, whatever brand you've got. I think these days there's a great equivalent to 100 to 400 on full frame. And, you know, for this kind of thing, just being able to zoom out a little bit, get the whole family dynamic here that was happening. These grown-up monkeys were really upset with this adolescent monkey, and the baby was just kind of taking it all in on mom's back, and she's like pulling its tail and they're screaming at it. And I have this whole series of that happening. Or you can zoom in and get these kind of, you know, environmental portraits that you get in between 100 and 400. This was taken out of the little Airbnb that we stayed in the week before the workshop, before we moved into the hotel where we were running the workshop out of. I just looked out the window and there was this green kingfisher on a tree branch, and I had the 100 to 400 on my camera and just kind of cracked the screen door and got this shot right through the screen door. This is at the Sloth Farm with the 100 to 400 and the 1.4 teleconverter, just zooming in and getting, you know, a portrait of the face through the leaves. This is with David's 400, the day that we were switching around. And it's interesting, you know, I think you saw the 400 has just gorgeous bokeh, and it's really nice that you can flip from 400 to 560 and it takes all the teleconverters. It's a wonderful general purpose lens. And for these dark conditions, you know, if that kind of money is in your budget, I don't think you can find a lens that'll make you any happier. I know, David, you're not longing after the 800, are you?
No, not so much. But
And I'm not longing after the 400. I really enjoyed it, but the 800 works for me. I was shooting with the 400, and this just kind of shows you, you know, my old favorite long lens was the 500 PF. And I shot this with David's 400. And then one of the workshop participants, David and I traded back, and one of the workshop participants wanted to play around with my 800. And so I traded their 500 with them. And the same shot with the 500 5.6, or, you know, similar. I didn't move around to get into the same framing position, but you can just see the difference wide open. It's pretty dramatic, you know. Now you're paying a lot of money for that difference. But the 500 PF is razor sharp and a wonderful lens to use out there. I'm going to show you one more I took with David's 400 that I just love. You know, just the ability to blow that background out that way and still retain the sharpness that you get, you know, it's just beautiful. But I would say
I will throw out there that while I'm sure that looking at a lens like that, the 400, and spending that kind of money, it is also possible, if you're going to a place like this, probably not right now, but in 6 months or so, you'll probably be able to rent that lens or comparable lens, the 800.
Absolutely.
You know, and you know, I mean, I can't see, you know, Sony's got a beautiful 600, but there's no freaking way that I can afford that lens at all. You know,
no, it's like second mortgage time for most
people. Yeah. So I mean, the 800 and the 400-2.8 are going to be in short supply for probably a year, but you know, they're going to reach a point where they are going to be rentable. You know.
Oh yeah.
I just want to throw that out.
You could sign up for a loaner at some point if you're MPS too.
Yeah.
But so there's the 400. Here's the 800. Smaller bird, even further away. And I will say that, you know, the 800 is still expensive. There's no two ways about it, but it's less than half as much as the 400. And I think for the birder out there, for the people who just adore birds, Ken Hauser on our workshop is just an amazing birder. Like, his knowledge of birds, it was like having this wonderful encyclopedia with us. And I think if birds are your thing, the 800 is a pretty stellar lens to have. Whether you can sneak up close to a beautiful bird like this and fill the frame, or whether you're further away. This is with the 1.4 teleconverter. So we're out at 1120 on the Z9 from this toucan. And here's, you know, just quite a long ways away at 800 of these scarlet macaws grooming in the tree. You know, this is the shot I was telling you about, where they were consistently eating these nuts off this palm tree. And so I would watch them fly in there, and then I changed my settings to 2,000th of a second. And this is a bit of a crop, but you know, it's not a lens to shoot birds in flight. I think your 100 to 400, maybe David's 400 with the teleconverter, if if you've got the money and you've got the talent. I think the 100 to 400 is a far easier lens to shoot birds in flight in brighter conditions, though, just because you're able to sort of start at 100 and zoom in as you catch focus. And it's really tricky with an 800 to try to find a bird in the air. You need to be seeing behavior, where they're perching, where they're landing, where they're consistently going, and then be ready for it, which is how I captured this.
You said this was a bit of a crop, Hudson. How frequently with these long lenses do you find yourself needing to crop in?
lot.
Yeah, I'd say more with the 400 than with the 800. Often I found myself trying to back myself into deep jungle just to get a little more distance to be sure I got the tail and the head and the frame at the same time. But there are times when something is small and far away. I just showed this frame of the toucan, and I wound up throwing my 1.4 teleconverter on because it was pretty small in the frame, and then I think I cropped a bit to boot. Even you've got 46 megapixels, why not? And I know David, he's sometimes throwing the camera into DX mode to get even more effective focal length reach with that 400 or the 560. You can flip the teleconverter lever and then you can shoot in DX mode and bring something in nice and close. And you do that a fair bit, don't you, David?
I do it a lot, and that gives me 840.
Yeah. See, there's all kinds of tricks now, and you get 19 megapixels, which is pretty darn good. I mean, for a long time, 20 megapixels was the sweet spot. That's the one great thing about having 47 megapixels, is that once you crop, you still have a nice printable image. I love the way the 800 renders. Oh, go ahead.
One of the things that's been asked, and I remember you talking about it, is the 800 takes a little bit of getting used to in terms of finding your subject. Can you talk about that a little bit? Okay.
I will absolutely talk about that. In fact, I'll pause for 1 second. We'll pause here on this heron shot for a second, the juvenile heron. I will say that my first few days out shooting with this, consistently, I walked around a wildlife refuge here for a couple of days really quick. I think some of you probably saw the YouTube stuff that I did, hummingbirds and things. And I would see something and I'm like, wait, that's that limb. Okay, a little, because just a little movement and you're completely changing your perspective. By the second day in Costa Rica, firing a few thousand frames through this thing, I'm picking it up and I'm saying, oh, well, there's the branch, just a little boom. And by the end of the workshop, I don't know, I put tens of thousands of frames through this lens and camera combo just by practice. It's just like sighting a telescope or something else. You get to the point where you're looking out there and you're on it. It takes practice, just like we are constantly running the mantra, I think, on the YouTube channel here in these office hours when we're out in the workshops. Practicing with your own gear and knowing how to use it is key. So I will say for Rick that you talked about renting one of these big lenses for a trip. Make sure you rent it a few days in advance of actually needing it, and go out and practice sighting a big long telephoto on the transformer box across the street from your house, on the kids, your grandchildren, on squirrels in the yard. Play with it, practice it, so that the first time you're out there and the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep is perched with rim light on the ridge and puffy clouds behind it, you're not going, where is it, until it runs away and you're frustrated. It is not easy to jump out and start using an 800 right off. It's not easy to jump out and start using a 400 handheld right off the bat.
Yeah.
So it's practice. And I know Bob Whitedrow here with the eclipse around him, we watched him shooting with a big lens the entire time we were in the Tetons last time, and he's got it down. It just takes time. Takes time. We actually had a nickname for you, Big Lens Bob, but I think after Costa Rica, David and I both get the Big Lens moniker as well. So, all right, let me jump back in here and share screen a little bit more. And we'll go full frame. I like the way the 800 renders the out of focus stuff too. This is just water sort of shimmering with wind on it in the background, and we're on a boat. And as I said, I shooting from the boat with the big long lens was a whole new thing. There's no way I could get to 30th of a second handheld on a bobbing boat in the river. You know, I was limited to about 100th of a second to be sure I was getting sharp frames. But we saw some really cool stuff from that boat. And I think that's one thing when you're shooting long lenses and wildlife and changing light and conditions, that constantly looking through your images, zooming in to see, is it really and truly sharp? Am I getting sharp images? Are my settings working? You know, what is the ISO? How much noise does this look like there is? This is another fun one. I love the ability to reach in. This is barely cropped at all. Right on the property at Crocodile Bay where David was talking about, like the first day we walked out there, boom, there was just this beautiful green reflection of the trees on the water, and this croc came up and started kind of drifting toward us. And I'm photographing it, and then I noticed that David is actually watching out for my, he's like, Pike, Pepper, I think you need to get away from the edge of the water, because it was coming closer and closer to us, and they're staring at it, wrapped in fascination. And I'm like, oh guys, yeah, listen to Uncle David, get away from the edge. It's like, let's get the kids away from the edge. Actually, I want to get away from the edge, but it was really fun. I mean, it just, I love the ability to bring a subject in that close. And I don't know. I will say I wasn't sure I was going to keep the 800, but after this trip, I don't think you can find more challenging conditions to work in. And I just love the results. You know, there's frequently going to be some things in the foreground when you're 800 millimeters away in the rainforest, but you can work compositions that kind of work despite having out of focus things in the foreground. You know, if something's close, you can get these intimate portraits. You know, this is not cropped at all. This is actually, again, out the window of the house that we rented, which backed right up to these mangroves. And at high tide, it just looked like it was wetland mangroves out the back window. And then it would kind of go down to mud flats. And when the tide went out and there was a ripe mango tree, and this whole group of capuchin monkeys came and started eating the mangoes right outside our house. It's a phenomenal surf lens. There were surfers out one day. David and I were out photographing them. And just, you know, these are really barely cropped at all. And the surf is, you know, breaking at normal distance. I think 800 is perfect for shooting surfing from shore. So basically the rest of this is all 800 stuff. And I had a blast shooting with this lens out there. The howler monkey. I watched him eat this entire thing, just peeling one leaf after the other and stuffing it into his mouth. I think that's that same wet sloth that David was photographing from another angle. It's fun. It really is. This was a beautiful moment where I don't know how Dennis saw that little macaw nest as we were flying down the road. We were kind of done for the day, and suddenly he's like, shh, 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 and he pulls off to the side. Tell the other van I got the walkie-talkie to David. All right, nobody get out. We're gonna back up. We're gonna get away. And then we all crept down the road like serpentine motion. Don't act like you're walking toward the tree. And we crept up to where we got within range to really get close-ups of them. Yeah, it's just fun. You know, I either one of these lenses would make me totally happy. But the 800 is fine for me. The 800 with the 100 to 400 combo is fantastic.
So,
and then the macro stuff. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, well, maybe while you're going through here, there's a few sort of general questions people asked about just sort of Costa Rica in general, sort of maybe what you guys really got out of the, you know, new stuff out of the trip from you. You know, there's people asking questions about, it sounds like a bunch of people are interested in going to Costa Rica.
Okay.
One asked when the next workshop in Costa Rica was, but we also have some people just sort of asking, you know, what was the weather like? Did you, you know, how did you prepare for it? And did you prepare for it properly? Have any problems at all with gear getting into or out of Costa Rica? I mean, there's just like a bunch of sort of general questions that maybe while you're
I've got like 6 macro shots. I'm done, and then let's hit all those questions because they're great. You know, this is that same frog I think David was photographing, and it just goes to show how ridiculously sharp that the new optics are. I think all the brands lenses are just doing amazingly these days. This is that 105 S lens from Nikon. And, you know, a little inspiration for these macros. This is natural light. This is natural light. This is set up with the lume cube on each side, doing a little cloning in the eyeball to get rid of the reflection of the light. And this one's just natural light, very small snake, actually. This one, again, natural light. You can see the photographers around it photographing in lenses. It's the light there. This is actually with a Leica that Elizabeth was kind enough to let me play around with, a Leica Q2, which is a 28 mm lens, but it has a close focus feature, and she had a macro attachment for it to get even closer. And, you know, just a totally different view of the world, photographing macro at 28 mm. These two images are both that. So you don't have to feel that you know, play around. You can use extension tubes. You can use other cameras that aren't necessarily, or lenses that aren't necessarily made for macro. There's lots of ways to kind of play around. These are, again, natural light. This one was lit with a Lume Cube. So play with it and submit some images for us. And I'll jump out of here, stop screen sharing, and we'll hit some of those questions about Costa Rica. I would say we're going to run another workshop in Costa Rica in 2024. We're going to use Dennis, and I intend to bring Dennis on for some Approaching the Scene episodes. I'd like to have a Zoom chat with him for an Approaching the Scene, because he's not only a fantastic local guide there, he's also a supremely knowledgeable conservationist. He knows the wildlife like the back of his hand. He doesn't miss any of it. And he's a great photographer, and he's constantly thinking of angles and camera settings and helping people get in position to get a better photograph. So it's like having a third full workshop instructor along. And I would urge anyone who wants to go to southern Costa Rica, to the Osa Peninsula where we were, or really almost anywhere in Costa Rica, talk to David or I and get the information. If you can't wait for 2024, to make sure that you link up with Dennis, because he's a treasure and he's a great, fun person to be with and super talented. And I want to do everything I can to promote him and what he's doing there. He's awesome. So preparing for Costa Rica, you know, I packed tank tops, board shorts, and very, very minimal sandals, and was quite happy with that. A raincoat. It was warm. It was never cold enough for me to throw a jacket on, except inside the air-conditioned dining room at the hotel. It rains a fair bit every day in the rainy season, which is the green season and a beautiful time to be out photographing and less crowded, because the tourism season is the dry season where people go to play and surf and stay dry. I think it's worth having a little bit of rain every day, to a significant amount of rain every day, to be able to have more to yourself and beautiful green rainforest. And I owe David
too.
Soft light. You don't want harsh shadows in those forests. We had a consistent amount of overcast, which led to the quality of these images. And I credit, you know, David Archer is the reason I was well prepared for this, because he's been there so many times and spent so much time there. He also found Dennis. So I owe a great debt of that gratitude to David, not only for helping run the workshop, but for having done the lion's share of the scouting and figuring out and making sure that we all had the right details. You fly into the capital city, San Jose, but then you take a small plane directly from that airport, or maybe you stay the night in a hotel, was how we had our participants do it. And catch a small plane. You know, it's about a 10, 12 passenger plane out to this little town, Puerto Jimenez, that's on the edge of this, it's in the middle of this huge swath of virgin rainforest on the coast. And it is a small plane. They charge you over if you have more than 50 pounds total with you. On my way out, I had about 100 pounds. They didn't blink. They just charged me $50, you know? So I brought way more than I should have, but on the way in, I didn't get charged at all, because my wife, my kids, and I all told didn't have more than 50 pounds each between us. And did they charge you on the way in, David?
Yeah, they charged me 63 coming in and 60 going out.
Yeah. So you ate a few pounds of stuff you brought with you.
Must have.
Yeah, it's a fantastic place. Really, really fascinating, fun. Just a plethora of things to shoot. And again, you know, you'll come out of there a better photographer. It's constant shooting. And we learned some cool new stuff. I'm going to be doing a whole ATS about a new method of culling that I really learned from Dennis. I'm sure he's not the only one doing it, but I'm going to credit him for it, which is instead of deleting the bad ones, mark the keepers and delete everything. And it seems crazy and it seems really hard to do, but when you're working with a camera that shoots 20 frames a second and you suddenly realize you've shot 7,000 frames that day and you only have about 10 hours to sleep, coming home with 300 images instead that you know are all razor sharp is a great way to roll. You know, you make sure you got a shot from each sequence that you like. But let's say you shot 20 frames or 80 frames of the same thing. You know, you can roll through and find the best one. There's some techniques for it, and I'll talk about that in approaching the scene. I started doing it, and my life got so much better. It's just a new world when you can shoot so many frames a second to try to get a sharp one in the middle of your burst. You know, let's say you shoot it at 150th of a second, you shoot a burst of 40, and then you lower your shutter speed to a 60th of a second, you shoot a burst of 40, and you lower it to a 30th of a second, you shoot a burst of 40, and then you go backwards, and you zoom into 100% on the face of the animal, and you use the click wheel to go backwards, and you find a sharp one at a 30th of a second at a lower ISO. It's all the same scene. Mark that protected, delete all. Boom. You just deleted 300 frames and kept one. Now all of a sudden you're not coming home with 7,000 images, having to render one-to-one previews because the camera instantly renders one-to-one previews. You can see that face and whether the eye is sharp as you flip through. Click, 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 click. That one's sharp. Mark, delete all. Go to the next shot. It's just an amazing technique. It's scary when you start doing it, but man, it's a lifesaver.
Yeah.
In conditions like this. So
yeah, those crazy burst modes are crazy, and at some point, you just don't want to have to walk through 5,000 images.
And you don't want to have your computer sit and render 5,000 one-to-one previews so that you're not sitting and watching the wheel spin to render the preview at 47 megapixels for every single frame. You know, the camera does
David,
that.
Are you doing that too? Or is it David? Are you doing that?
Haven't yet because I have so many images on that card. I have a really big card.
Yeah.
But when I start over with a clean card, I am going to switch to that.
Okay. All right.
Well, and here's the thing. The day we were on the boat, I couldn't keep up. We just had a constant, I mean, while I'm trying to figure out whether I got a sharp one from the last shot, all of a sudden there's a group of baby, you know, small blue herons. And you're like, oh my God, I got to shoot those. And pretty soon it starts stacking up and you're behind by way too many shots to keep up. That night, I went back to the hotel. The Warriors were playing the Celtics. I put the game on, listened, put my eye to the eyepiece and sat for 2 hours doing it in my room. I went through and marked all the best ones in camera, hit delete all, and I had 7,000 images I took that day on the boat. I imported 230.
That's pretty awesome.
It's easy to go through 230.
Yeah.
So, and it's so much quicker doing it with the camera. You just won't believe it. You can take the lens off and just have a body cap on. It's nice and light in your hand. You can use the diopter adjusted viewfinder. If your eye gets tired, put your reading glasses on if you're me and look at the back LCD, switch back and forth. It's just wonderful.
Marvin asked how was your experience with the Nye Evo packs with respect to travel and all that sort of stuff?
I love these packs so much. You know, and for those of you who are tuning into the office hours, they're going through kind of a revolution at Nye Evo. They're working on becoming sort of the first camera backpack manufacturer that's sustainable. And I have this new red one that you can kind of see the edge of, which I didn't put in my video, but that's actually the pack I took to Costa Rica. And it's a new fabric that they're using that's made 100% from recycled fishing nets they pull out of the ocean. And the packs are amazing. They're so comfortable. They carry a lot of weight, a little weight, super comfortably. They're modular. And, you know, I had that video where I pulled my medium ICU out that had everything but the 800 I was taking with me, put the 800 in the pack in its case and threw it in the overhead and put the rest of the stuff in the camera unit under my seat in front of me. They're just great. They come with a built-in pack cover, which was handy for us out on the property at Crocodile Bay when we got caught in a huge thunderstorm. I just threw the pack cover over everything. they're just they're the best pack I have yet used. But when you consider the harness, the modularity, the organizational setup, just how well it's thought out from a photographer's perspective and a backpacker's perspective, it puts the weight right on your hips where you want it. It's comfortable and it's well laid out. I don't know, Rick, you love yours.
I love mine too. I've been buying bags for way too long, and this is the first one I feel like, at least at this size, that works the way I want to work. It's a pretty great bag.
David at the end of the workshop's like, what do I have to do to get in this Naya Evo train, after he was watching me?
Two sort of final questions. One's a quick one. A couple people have asked about, in the ATS, you showed a video, and a couple of people said it seemed kind of shaky. Would you use a monopod or a tripod if you were shooting video with that 800?
The bit with the because I didn't have time to get back to the car, which I had left to get my tripod. Yeah, it's shaky. The part with the sloths was also handheld and real sharp and stable, but that was with the 100 to 400 handheld carefully. With the 800, yeah, you want a tripod for video. I mean, it's got great image stabilization, and you can fire burst modes off at a really low shutter speed and get some sharp frames in the middle. But shooting video with an 800, you want a good fluid head, or at least the Acrotech panorama head. Would have worked just fine for me if I wasn't doing movements, but the fluid head would be perfect for shooting video with it. Yeah, and it would be smooth and stable. Yeah, that everything I showed in that was handheld. I really just never used my tripod or monopod on this trip.
So noise, you're in these situations where your ISO is pretty high. How high did you feel like you could go with the Z9? And, we've talked about noise reduction stuff. How much of the stuff you've been processing so far from Costa Rica have you run through? Your denoise app of choice is DxO Pure Raw, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So what percentage are you running through DxO from the trip?
Well, okay. So I would say that if an image is really portfolio grade and matters to me, and it's over 4,000 ISO or 4,000 ISO or more from the Z9, I'm going to run it through there. Same thing probably goes for the Z50. Up to about 3,200, I can do a pretty good job just using Lightroom's detail panel to pull back the noise and regain the sharpness with the sliders. But if I am in love with an image that's 4,000 ISO or higher, I'm just, before I do a single thing to it, going to mark it, select them all, and batch them through DxO Pure Raw 2. And then, I don't know, DxO's got to eventually solve it, but both on Mac and PC, I'm finding that it takes a really long time for the import process to go. It's nice the way that they've got it set up and plug in extras in Lightroom, but if you're in a hurry, it's actually quicker to mark those images somehow, get them into an external folder, run them through as a standalone, and then re-import them into Lightroom. The glitch is that it just takes Lightroom a really long time after they're done processing to re-import them. I mean, I can sit and work and do other things. It's happening somewhere in the background. And then, if you batch 30 or 40 images through it, it can take 20 minutes. There's a 20-minute gap after the slider stops moving and all of them have been processed. And then all of a sudden it pops up, oh, ready to import. And, you might as well go eat lunch and come back. And it's some kind of little bug in their Lightroom plugin. I don't know. It's not the processor taking, it's just the reimportation.
I see that that little box with the Mac Studio behind you. That would be interesting to see how well it does with the intake on that. I'm sure we'll be hearing about that. You've done an ATS on DxO, right?
I did it ATS while I was in Costa Rica. Actually, I did it before that, went out while I was in Costa Rica with one of those hummingbird shots with this lens at 4,000 ISO, about how I treat exactly what I do. I ran one through DxO out of Lightroom, waited for it to import. It was only one image and it just took an extra 2 minutes after it was done. But it takes about 2 minutes per image. So if you batch a bunch of them, it can take a long time.
Yeah.
And then just work through it. I mean, what DxO Pure Raw does for me that the others don't is it just somehow filters the noise out without reducing any detail and without creating any artifacts in the out of focus details. And I don't see any artifacts. And it unlike the other processors out there that do that, I can still go in Lightroom after the fact, and it's like I'm dealing with an image that's 1600 ISO instead of say 8000 ISO. I can still do a little bit more noise reduction to my taste, a little bit more sharpening, and the image holds up to it. It's a DNG that comes out. And then, the thing you're giving up when you do this is you're demosaicing and raw processing that raw data that came out of your camera through DxO's raw processing engine. And it's spitting out, a linear DNG that's very editable, but it's not exactly a raw file anymore. It's been processed through DxO. So now you're going to be using
partially processed.
It's partially
actually,
processed.
I've been doing a bunch of research into this the linear DNG that the noise apps create is a partially demosaic raw file. It's close. Okay. It's not exactly a raw file, but it's pretty darn close. And manipulating it in Lightroom is close enough to editing the original raw file. And if you're an one user and you use no noise, the whole thing is processed inside Photo Raw, which would be, I would say if you're an on-one user, if you're using Photo Raw and it's built in, I'd probably use that over DxO. It's not bad.
Absolutely. I think On1's no noise is actually really quite good.
Yeah.
It requires a little more tweaking. It's not a push a button and let it do its thing automatically. With DxO, I just choose deep prime and let it run.
Yeah.
But with On1, you want to look at it a little bit and pull that slider, but it does a great job and you're staying in the same raw processor from cradle to grave, which is great.
Yeah.
And I would absolutely recommend On1 users just stay in On1. Do the no noise AI right off the bat, then raw process, and then finish edit and effects.
Yeah.
But I really do like DxO Pure Raw 2 on these files from the Z9. It just spits out a beautiful, even at 10, 12,000 ISO. I'm setting my limit at 14,400 with this camera. I'd rather underexpose a little past there than go higher. That's been my experience, but I get good results from 14,000 ISO images. So, all
right. Well, I think we've wasted another good hour of everyone's time. Next office hours on July 19th, macro gallery. You'll have an ATS talking a little bit about the techniques you did on macro.
Next
before then. So, and Woody said he's already got it up. So.
Good job, Woody. Right. Thanks, David, for sharing for the whole workshop and for sharing those beautiful images and for trading lenses around and having such a good time out there. It was great. And a big thanks to everybody in this Zoom room that and on YouTube that was in the workshop. We had a good time. We had a really good time. It was just a blast. So, all right. And I can't wait to take another group out in 2024. It was so much fun. So thanks to everybody for watching, and we'll see you on the 19th, right?
Yep. All right, everybody. Take care.
Oh, and sign up for the Tetons if you want.